Why is change so difficult? Whether it's by an individual, a country or an organization. To answer that, we need to go right back to the beginning. What would you see if you could look inside the head of a child that's just been born? You'd see a number of neurons and synapses, which together form a kind of software that we already have when we're born. That software makes sure you breathe automatically, that you start to suck when something is put in your mouth, and that you start to cry when you're wet. Even though you have no knowledge of the words hungry and wet yet. At the age of 6 you see that large numbers of links have been made between the neurons, while at 14 there aren't quite as many of those links. What's happened is that up to the age of 6 you're seeing and storing everything for the first time. You're creating a conceptual framework in which you store all those new experiences. And from the age of 6 you use this framework, which forms the basis for everything you think, to compare, order and consider everything you experience. One limitation of this process is that your framework also acts as a filter through which you view the world, and it makes you look for things that confirm your own framework. The links between neurons are created by repetition. Sometimes that takes 5 repetitions, sometimes 30, but in some cases just once is enough to create a strong link, for example in case of a trauma. Some tragic examples are those of children brought up in hen houses or with apes, and who, because of all the repetitions they see, even start to behave and feed like chickens. In other words, their conceptual framework is very different from that of someone in a normal human environment. How your life will turn out is already to a large extent determined by the time you're 6. That's because you've written a script. Not only individually, families and even countries also have their own scripts. You can see that by the way people in other countries have a completely different view of things. For example, what do they think about taking initiative? If you ask people in Spain whether they think it's important to show initiative in their work, you'll find 13% will say yes, while in the Netherlands the figure is 80%, which shows that taking initiative is part of the script in the Netherlands but not in Spain. To summarize, we all have software in our heads which is sensitive to repetition, and if something is repeated often enough, it will eventually, as far as we're concerned, become true. This truth then forms the basis for your own values and beliefs. We can explain these by the logic of our own thinking, but that logic, which we often confuse with rationality, is really only a subjective truth. As example, Derek Sivers explains the following.
So imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in America, and a Japanese man walks up to you and says, "Excuse me, what is the name of this block?" And you say, "Well, there's Snyder Ave, there's Reed Ave, that's 27th Street, this is 26th. And he says, yes, but what is the name of that block?" You say, "I'm sorry, blocks don't have names. Streets have names. Blocks are just the unnamed spaces in between the streets." He leaves a little confused and disappointed. So now imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in Japan, and you turn to the person next to you and you say, "Excuse me, what is the name of this street?" And they say, well, that's block 17, this is block 16. And you say, "Yeah, but what's the name of this street?" They say, "Well, streets don't have names. Blocks have names. That's block 17, this is 16. Look at the map. There's block 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. All of these blocks have names. Streets are just the unnamed spaces in between the blocks." You're a little confused, but you say, "Okay, then how do you do your home address?" And they say, "Easy. This is District 8, block 17, house number 1. You say, "Okay, but walking around I notice that the house numbers don't go in order." And they say, "But they do. They go in the order in which they were built. So the first house ever built on a block is house number 1. Second house ever built is house number 2. Third house ever built is house number 3, etc." So it's funny that sometimes you need to go to the opposite side of the world to realize assumptions you didn't even know you had, and that the opposite may also be true.
It's good to be aware that our logic depends entirely on our conditioning. And what happens when we have to operate outside our own logic? Well, I can give you a good example of that. I was in Hanoi, I was very tired, and in the morning I stepped outside and there was traffic everywhere and I had no idea how to cross the road because in my logic I was looking for traffic lights and signs and policemen and there weren't any of those. Until somebody told me, just start walking, because our logic is that everybody sticks to his or her own speed, whether they're in a car, on a bike or on foot. So everybody else in turn can figure out how fast they have to drive or walk. And then you think, yeah, that might be true. But so the first step I took on that crossing full of traffic was completely against my own instincts. And it felt life-threatening because I had to follow a completely different logic. But I walked out into that square and kept walking at the same speed, and after a while I felt, yes, that's how it works here. And I gradually began to understand and accept their logic. So when we're talking about change, whether it affects individuals or organizations that have to go through big change processes, it's tremendously important to realize that it almost always means rewriting your own logic. And for individuals, that can really be a life-threatening experience.